I'd like to hear from you, which I want to reserve to the end of the conversation, is the compatriots whom you think should actually take up the mantle. Because it is one thing to criticize, it's another thing to recommend, and it is another thing to take the bold step to say, this is a person I think should be the candidate. Because we've heard over and over, different people are giving different criteria for the presidency, but they don't exercise their freedom of identifying the person they want to be the leader of the country. I want to keep this question for the end, and I want to hear from you what you think about that and whom you think should actually be the president. I hope you're not going to evade the question or run around circles with this particular question when I bring that to you.
Well, you know my style. You know that I say what I believe in and I hold true to what I say. And so I look forward to your question by the time we get to the end of the program.
Sometimes you're always very diplomatic and very evasive with your questions, like the one I put to you.
The Beyond Africa podcast. Welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast, the only platform where experts share their views on African issues.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining the Beyond Africa podcast with me, Ngalim Bernard, your host. As I've told you before, this season is consecrated to Cameroon because Cameroon is organizing presidential elections, and these elections are very critical for the life of the country for a few reasons. The first reason is the president is 93 years old. He's been president for 43 years. Before then, he's been prime minister and held other ministerial portfolios. And in 2025, he is running to succeed himself. If he wins, he get another 7-year mandate, and this mandate ends when he will be 99 years old. That is a milestone. Call it positive, call it negative, that has never been experienced anywhere else. Could this be the fate of Cameroon? Would Cameroonians let this happen to them? Or are Cameroonians willing to have a president who leaves office at 99 years old? Lots of machinations have been going on in the field. Political candidates have been excluded. The current government has been convening political meetings at the Presidency of the Republic, and observers have questioned the credibility and transparency of the electoral management body, that is Electoral, and the Constitutional Council. Of course, with me today is no other person but one who has observed elections throughout Africa for at least the last 3 decades. He understands what politics are. He understands democracy from its very foundation right to the ballot box. And he has met with different presidents and politicians across Africa. He's been disappointed by some who were in the opposition when they took power. They changed their modus operandi. And he's been happy with some. But one thing that struck me about him is that he created an organization for former presidents to sit and talk about African issues. If you don't know whom this person is, I present my guest to you. Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, you are welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast again.
Well, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with you. And I must start by commending you for your efforts to bring Africa into the conversations, into global conversations, and really focusing the spotlight for these recent months on Cameroon as the country goes into what could be a watershed moment in October of 2025 presidential elections within the context that you just so aptly described. It's truly a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. In November 2024, I hosted you, and it was a very interesting conversation because we analyzed issues from Africa to Cameroon to the world. And that, to me, is very important because the foundational principle of this podcast is to bridge the gap between the African diaspora and the African continent so that we work together to build a strong continent that will be dependent on the continent and not on people outside the continent. We are still very dependent on the West. Now we are going to the East, but Africa needs to be one continent that takes care of itself. And I know you've been working so hard to achieve this by bringing stakeholders together. Do you have the feeling that there is any positive strides towards this? Let's talk about this before we start talking about the watershed moment in Cameroon.
Sure, I think that's a positive stride in the sense that increasingly African countries and African policymakers are beginning to recognize the capital role of the African diaspora. We are the one continent that has got members of its diaspora scattered across the globe, everywhere from the United States, across Europe, Latin America, Brazil, Colombia, even in Asia, in countries like Thailand and Indonesia, even in Australia, you've got people of African descent who continue to show interest in the continent, who have the expertise and the wherewithal to be able to invest in the motherland. And I think that awakening is being felt in a number of African countries. Some have positioned themselves to take advantage of the diaspora. Others still have a lot of work to do. But for me, this is a sign that ultimately that Africans recognize that ultimately we are going to have to take back our continent and build it up. We have what it takes. It just requires us aggregating our synergies, our positive synergies, in a way that can make Africa rise again.
You were in Africa, in Cameroon recently, and what is the Cameroonian government doing to bring in the African diaspora? And most of those in the diaspora that I host on this platform from Cameroon feel that the government is intentionally keeping them away from African or from Cameroonian affairs, from Cameroonian politics, like making it impossible for them to register on the electoral rolls to vote on October 12th.
Well, if you go into archives with some of your media colleagues back in Cameroon, they will tell you that I've been quite consistent on this issue, that even going back to the 90s, to the early 2000s, I was always decrying the tensions that I saw between the government of Cameroon and the Cameroonian diaspora. And I bemoaned the fact that unlike other countries, such as Benin, such as Mali, such as Senegal, that really cultivate their respective diasporas in a way that provides some synergy and a symbiotic relationship, that in the case of Cameroon, we've got tensions, we've got hostilities, we've got a relationship that needs a lot of work to bring it to the point where the diaspora's contributions could be recognized, appreciated, valued, and where the diaspora itself would feel that its responsibility is not just to seek political space, but also to contribute to the development of the country. I mean, one example that comes to mind for me is when President Macky Sall was president of Senegal. He spent an inordinate amount of time raising money through treasury bonds of the government of Senegal with its diaspora. And he was getting billions of projects funded in Senegal through contributions from the Senegalese diaspora. There's no reason why a country like Cameroon, with the kind of diaspora that we have, with the professionals that we have, with the entrepreneurs that we have, that I would leverage that. Yes.
Yeah, there is one problem that the government of Cameroon has often raised, that the diaspora, people like yourself, often criticize the government of Cameroon. You don't contribute positive ideas for the development of the country. You spend all your time criticizing the government. Therefore, they are justified in keeping you out of public affairs in Cameroon. So why do you feel the blame is on the government instead of on you, who spend all your time criticizing the government?
Well, criticism is not a bad thing. And if you have to do with a government that starts off saying, I'm being criticized, therefore I shut out the diaspora because of the criticism that comes from the diaspora, then the problem is not with the government. Sorry, the problem is not with the diaspora, it's with those that are elected to govern and those that are agnostic to any level of criticism. Criticism should be welcomed, because people criticize because they want to see improvement. They want to see a betterment on the conditions of life, of livelihood of their fellow compatriots. And so if you have someone who criticizes the government and who at the same time makes recommendations on how things could be done better, I mean, governments sometimes they pay experts to write reports and make recommendations for them. They should be more than willing to accept those recommendations, that criticism, positive criticism, coming from their fellow compatriots who even know the country better than foreign-trained experts.
How would it be positive criticism when the government believes that you do all this in bad faith because you are living out of the country and you are not conscious of the current situations in the country?
No, I think that's a very faulty argument, because the saying goes, you can give a dog a bad name in order to hang it. The world is a small village nowadays. Many people in the diaspora are as connected to the realities of Cameroon as people living in the country. And sometimes you may even experience this on a personal basis. There are times when you have to inform family members in Bamenda or in Kumba or even in Douala about what is happening in Garawa or in Marawa or in Bafusa. And they're not aware of this. There are people in the diaspora who are paying school fees for family members, who are paying health and hospital bills for family members, whose family members are getting stuck in being able to travel from one part of the country to the other. And so I would not take that as an excuse. I would say the diaspora is as versed with what's happening on the ground in the country as other Cameroonians are.
Thank you. Let us talk elections. When I hosted you in November 2024, I asked you if you're going to run in October 2025 for the President of the Republic. You did not give me a clear-cut answer, but you've spent all your time since then till today pinpointing why Paul Biya shouldn't be the candidate, telling Cameroonians Paul Biya has failed, and you are falling short of telling us why you feel you are incompetent to run the country. In my introduction, I said you've worked with presidents, you've worked with opposition leaders who've become presidents in their country. Why do you think you are not that person to rule Cameroon, or do you feel more comfortable being a critique of the system?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack in your question. First, I would say it's not a matter of competence. That is not in doubt. It's not that I feel that I couldn't be more competent than some of the folks that are out there now. That's not the question. The issue is that should also not disqualify me from being able to state what I think a leader needs to be able to lift up Cameroon from where it is today. It is important to also share ideas, including policy positions, with some of the people who are competing for office, with the sense that even if one is not a candidate, there are multiple ways in which one can also make a contribution. And I think that even my own experience should serve as a teaching moment at a time like this, when we're hearing from the population that they would rather the candidates leave behind their personal interests and their own egos and work in ways that can allow the country to experience meaningful change without putting forward the concept that it is either them or no one else. And so I think I should be commended for that. And as I've always said in the past, the time would come when I would be ready to make myself available and to be able to show ultimately to my fellow compatriots what I can do to bring about an improvement in their well-being and in the reputation and standing of the country, not just across Africa, but across the globe.
The point here is not whether you are competent or you're not competent. We don't question your competence. We question your modus operandi. We question how you're doing it. Why do you just feel comfortable pinpointing the difficulties or the challenges that the current government has, rather than stepping up to execute the failures that you always recommend? Is it clear that it is easier said than done?
No, I think we have to recognize that in the lead up to the 2018 elections, for example, to be very concrete, I did lay out what I thought needed to be done to prepare the country for a healthy and inclusive and peaceful electoral process. One of the issues that I put on the table at the time was that I couldn't understand why there was priority being laid on the elections as opposed to resolving what is popularly known as the Anglophone conflict, which became an armed conflict in 2017. I said very publicly that I could not, while this armed conflict was raging in the Anglophone part of the country, which is my part of the country, I could not, under those circumstances, see myself gallivanting around and quote-unquote campaigning for an election when the priority ought to be on resolving that conflict and attending to the grievances, the legitimate political grievances that had been raised by Anglophones.
And this is 2025. You're still not there.
Exactly. Fast forward 7 years, and we've seen how that conflict has been mismanaged. We've seen thousands of lives that have been lost. We've seen close to 1 million displaced persons, about 800,000 of them internally displaced, and over 100 refugees, even in Nigeria alone. The circumstances have worsened in 2025 from what they were in 2018, and it wouldn't make sense for me 8 years later, with circumstances that have worsened, to then go out there and say I'm canvassing for votes when you couldn't even run a genuine campaign in the northwest or southwest regions of the country. And so there are issues that need to be done. But if there are other compatriots in country who feel that they can step up to the challenge and who request my ideas and my support, I should be willing to do that in all selflessness. And I think that's something that ought to be applauded.
One thing I would like to hear from you, which I want to reserve to the end of the conversation, is the compatriots whom you think should actually take up the mantle. Because it is one thing to criticize, it's another thing to recommend, and it is another thing to take the bold step to say, this is the person I think should be the candidate. Because we've heard over and over, different people are giving different criteria for the presidency, but they don't exercise their freedom of identifying the person they want to be the leader of the country. I want to keep this question for the end, and I want to hear from you what you think about that and whom you think should actually be the president. I hope you're not going to evade the question or run around circles with this particular question when I bring that to you.
Well, you know my style. You know that I say what I believe in, and I hold true to what I say. And so I look forward to your question by the time we get to the end of the program.
Sometimes you're always very diplomatic and very evasive with your questions, like the one I put to you in November 2024, and you evaded a question on whether you're going to contest or not. So I hope you don't evade that question today.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. You mentioned the call by citizens for a coalition candidate or a unified candidate or one candidate for the opposition. Is that a practical approach to take? And all candidates in any election actually drop their candidatures to support one person?
Well, you know, I think it really depends on the vision that one has. There is always a saying that if the only tool you have in your toolkit is a hammer, then you're going to be tempted to see every problem as a nail. And so if people are limited in the way in which they approach these problems or this particular issue, there's going to be a tendency to say it's not possible. All the candidates have already paid a registration fee of 30 million CFA francs each, and nobody's going to want to forfeit that. They can come up with a long list of reasons why that is not feasible. On the other hand, if they want to be reasonable, if they go at it from the realization that over the years, the best time, the only time that an opposition candidate won or almost won a presidential race was in 1992. And the reason was because there was a united front that rallied around Ni John Frundi, the SDF candidate at the time. And over the past 30 years, no opposition candidate has come close to doing what Frundi did in 1992 with the coalition that coalesced around him. No party, no candidate in the present context with the present electoral code that allows for a one-round election. There is none of those 11 opposition candidates who can tell you point blank that he or she, because there's one woman running, has the wherewithal, has the operational machinery to be able to take on the ruling party, which oftentimes benefits from state institutions such as the security, the administrative setup with the divisional officers and senior divisional officers. No one candidate or political party is going to do that. If you come at it from that perspective, then the next question is going to be, how then do you put together a process that can aggregate all of these voices that want genuine change in Cameroon? And in
Before we come to that,
that can only come about if you have a unified candidate or you have a single candidate with a mandate and a program that all of the other opposition candidates adhere to and support.
Yeah, before we come to that, you said in 1992, Frundi almost won. I hosted Thibault Nach here, and he said he's surprised that the Supreme Court at the time declared Paul Biya a winner because what he saw did not reflect that declaration. I hope at the National Democratic Institute, you people also have that view. But my question here is about the coalition candidate. In 2004, there was a coalition candidate. When Frundi pulled out of the coalition, he came second and the coalition candidate came third. Does that not eliminate or dismiss or weaken the thesis that when parties come together, they become better at the elections?
No, it does not, because Frundi was a personality of blessed memory, was a personality of his own. The SDF at the time is not the SDF of today. And that example, all it goes to show that if the number 2 and the number 3 had worked together, they would have produced a better result than they obtained in 2004.
But that wasn't going to change anything because I think Paul Biya won with a huge margin, above 50% in 2004.
Yes, except that the circumstances in 2025 are now different. And
What is different?
I have even said in previous interviews that the 2005 election is winnable, and the prospect that this could be winnable should be an incentive for those competing in the race to really figure out how they could win this at the ballot.
What makes it winnable as opposed to previous elections?
First of all, the coalition that has supported the ruling party, the CPDM, over the years is now fragmented. That fragmentation has never happened since 1992. And so you have candidates that are emerging from the northern part of the country, which has been over the years a traditional bastion of support to the ruling party. And the ruling party is now going to have to fight it out in the north, in a territory that provides over 30% of the electorate, which has always been very loyal to the ruling party in the past. Secondly, you also have President Biya, Incumbent President Paul Biya, whom, as you said, will soon be 93 years old in February 2025, who is today 92 years and 7 months old, who is no longer physically able to go out and campaign across the 10 regions of the country, who is not going to be able to articulate why Cameroonians should give him another 7-year mandate when he's 92 years old. You also, thirdly, you have a youth bulge, a bulge of young people who are facing the most difficult economic times, who can't find employment, who are grappling with issues of healthcare, who are looking for opportunities for a younger generation of leadership in the country. And if you aggregate all of these issues, you see that the opposition, if it were better organized, has a fighting chance of winning the elections in 2025 than they've had since 1992.
You have said that the CPDM and Paul Biya are taking advantage of state institutions. And by these state institutions, you mentioned the military and the administration. And in your interview with Randy Josa, you said what happened at the Constitutional Council was not justice, because even a blind person could see that there was no justice when Maurice Kamto's candidature was rejected. Now, with this litany of positives and optimism that you have listed about the coalition candidate, are you saying that the coalition candidate is automatically going to reverse the state capture and Elecam and the Constitutional Council would declare the coalition candidate winner if that person is actually voted winner?
That's an excellent question, and nothing can be guaranteed in the context where things have been done in a non-transparent fashion, or in a context where certain institutions have functioned with very opaque old habits that are not relevant in a democratic context. But by the opposition coming together, the opposition rallying together would change the dynamics on the ground. They would immediately transform the election into a referendum on Biya. And so, rather than go to the forces that want change and say to them, we've got a list of 11 candidates to choose from, you would be telling them that you've got one candidate who can compare and contrast with Biya's balance sheet and with Biya as a person. And so that becomes a referendum on Biya. You cannot have a referendum on Biya and the CPDM and the 43 years of bad governance in Cameroon if you've got a multiplicity of opposition candidates trying to sing the same song with different verses and from different hymn books. That's the advantage of having a single candidate or a candidate around whom the rest of the opposition rallies. Secondly, at the operational level, that's going to make it extremely easy for the 8 million or so registered voters to be able to discern what happens on election day, to be able to have a yes or no vote on election day, and to be able to trace the vote tabulation, the counting and tabulation of votes, and the transmission of those votes to Elecam in Yaoundé. If you have a multiplicity of candidates, it's going to be very difficult to do that. And so those are some of the practical
Dr.
advantages that come into play.
Dr. Chris, we have often seen your employer, that is the National Democratic Institute, and other institutions and organizations deploy election monitors. And sometimes, or most often, they always say that the irregularities were not as serious enough as to change the outcome of the elections. So what is going to change in this case? Is it simply because there's a coalition candidate and there's a momentum around the election that these election monitors are going to see something else?
Well, the National Democratic Institute, NDI, the organization that I work for, is extremely proud of its work across the globe, around the world, not just in Africa, but around the world. And when you speak about organizations or observer delegations that have traditionally said the irregularities did not change the outcome, I will beg to differ. And I would ask you to go through the archives. And I say that with the certainty that NDI is not one of such organizations. We know that there are multiple organizations that do this. We even know that in the case of Cameroon, in the last elections in 2018, there were people who were presented as international observers who turned from Transparency International, who turned out not to be international observers. We know that in some countries that are not very open and that are not democratic societies, there's a lot of shenanigans around what happens with election observation missions. But NDI is extremely proud of its track record that can be verified across the world. The proof is that in 1992, as Ambassador Thibault Nash even mentioned to you in his own interview, NDI was the only organization that said very clearly in writing in its report that the 1992 elections were meant to fail. And I will encourage your viewers and Cameroonians of goodwill to go back to the NDI report of 1992, because every time I reread that report, I come to the conclusion that the recommendations of that report are as valid today as they were over 30 years ago. That doesn't bode well for our democracy, but it speaks to the fact that there are organizations out there that may be tempted to whitewash a situation, but there are other organizations out there that do their work in a very professional manner, along the lines of the International Declaration of Principles with regards to election observation, and NDI is one of them. Additionally, I would say that over the years, we've also seen in many African countries, Nigeria, Kenya, even in Malawi as we speak, South Africa, Ghana, Ethiopia, Senegal, we see citizens organize themselves to deploy their own observers, citizen observers from the country itself, where they recruit, train, and deploy thousands of observers to monitor what happens around the electoral period. And those observers, in the case of Cameroon, should be preparing themselves to also go out, monitor the process, track the election results, track the compilation and announcement of election results, and make statements that can inform their fellow compatriots about the credibility of the electoral process. And it's this African capital, this human capital that we see burgeoning across African countries that gives me hope that election observation is no longer an exercise just for international observers. It is part of the process that Africans themselves have embraced and are willing to execute around our elections to make them more meaningful and more credible.
Talking about citizen observers, I had a conversation with Michelle Ndoki and Kingsley Shete of Nation Builders. So they are working on this initiative, and I'll share the link to their network below so anyone who is interested can get in touch with them. They are building a database of Cameroonians who will be represented at all the polling stations so they can capture the results on the day of the declaration of results, on the elections day on October 12th, and send it straight to their servers, and they will do a compilation. From there, they will make a statement as to the outcome of the results. And thank you so much for the details about the NDI and their work they are doing and the report of the 1992 elections. But still, I want to go back into that 1992 election and the outcome. 30 years later, NDI has continued working. I don't know to what extent the NDI collaborates with the government of Cameroon. But if your 1992 report was to the effect that the elections were not credible and needed to be redone, how can you continue collaborating with them, if at all you do collaborate with that government, throughout the last 30 years?
Well, the response to your question is in the question itself. To say that NDI has not had any programming in Cameroon since 1992. We've had other organizations, sister organizations, that have gone in and have tried to do some work, but have also come to the conclusion that the political environment, the political space, did not lend itself for the kind of work that organizations like ours conduct.
Does that mean that the NDI identified a problem and decided to abandon Cameroonians unto themselves because the problem became a problem to the NDI?
No, it just means that it takes two to tango, and that when a serious organization does its work in a very professional manner and makes recommendations, what we've seen with other countries is that the countries have taken the time to study the recommendations. They've then asked for follow-up meetings to discuss the implementation of those reforms, and they've in many cases initiated reforms that have made their electoral processes more meaningful and more inclusive. In the age of competitive resources, it becomes extremely difficult to explain or to rationalize or justify why you would spend resources in country X where there is no political will for reform, whereas citizens and governments in country A or B require or desire an engagement with you that can help them strengthen their democratic institutions and reform their institutions and political processes. So that's a judgment call that every organization has to make, and that may explain why when you go into a country like Benin or Senegal or Botswana or Ghana, you see a flourishing of organizations that work with those governments and civil society and political parties to strengthen their political processes, and why, on the other hand, when you come into a country like Cameroon, it's extremely difficult to see those independent organizations functioning. And when you even see civil society organizations that are homegrown organizations, you just need to sit down with them and hear the challenges that they face on a daily basis, the harassment that they face, the difficulties they face in even organizing activities. And you come to the conclusion that under the present context, it's extremely difficult to have meaningful contributions that can be impactful and warrant the investments that need to be made by various actors and organizations.
So when you meet with these civil society organizations and they tell you that these are the problems that they have, they cannot operate fairly and smoothly, you as a Cameroonian, you decide to abandon them. You don't look for other means of helping them to bring change into their own country. You just let them back to themselves.
Nope. Again, I think you just answered the question yourself, because that's why I'm not letting up, because I've got my NDI responsibilities for sure, but I've also got my Cameroonianness, which I need to assert, because I can't just because my organization can work there, allow for the Democrats of the country to languish, allow for citizens who are very brave and courageous and who are looking for opportunities to improve the overall climate and improve the well-being of their fellow compatriots to be stranded. And so there are multiple ways in which someone like me could lend their support, even if I don't have to go through the organization that I represent.
Let me hear from you. What support have you lent to the opposition parties as they are struggling to get either a consensus candidate or they are struggling to navigate through this very difficult political terrain to get a new government in Cameroon?
Well, I couldn't really speak to that, but in line with your previous question, you may be aware of the fact that I personally have had a foundation in Cameroon that was launched in 1999 to work on humanitarian issues across the country. That even prior to the Anglophone conflict, I invested a lot in educational programs, in humanitarian programs. I spent over 2 weeks in the north when Boko Haram was at its peak, visiting academic institutions in the extreme north, in the north and in Adamawa regions, talking to kids about the importance of education and staying in school. I did humanitarian programs across all 10 regions of the country. And since the Anglophone conflict, I've spent a lot of my time and the foundation's time working with internally displaced persons, IDPs, or visiting refugees in refugee camps in Nigeria. This is what I do on my own time as a Cameroonian who cares about his fellow compatriots. And I think that humanitarian aspect is much needed, even needed now more than ever before. And that's something that I will continue to do in my personal capacity.
I must confess that the very first time I stepped my foot into a radio station to be interviewed by a journalist was in your foundation's radio, and I was a young student at the university then. I don't know if you can find the bands, but that would be interesting to get.
Well, thank you very much for bringing that up. I think the foundation radio manager would be very pleased to hear that, and they're thinking about creating an alumni network of all the young people who went through foundation radio in Bamenda and who today have become big shots, so that you all can give back to the community through foundation radio. Thank you for reminding me that I should give them your contact.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I'd like to get in touch with them. Yeah, let's get back into the elections. You've spoken about the coalition and you seem to have that at heart. And you mentioned the list of issues that the various candidates seem to put at the front as a stumbling block to forming that coalition. When I hosted Prince Michael Ekosongwese here on this platform, he said one of the ideas they were putting together was to let the candidates rally behind one person and then put out a clear call out there to Cameroonians of goodwill to understand that the 30 million registration fees have been lost for the other 10 candidates, and they should help raise the money and reimburse them. Is that the critical point you find that is prohibiting or impeding this coalition? Is it a money factor or is it the personal issues?
I think the money factor is important. Some of these candidates also need to acknowledge that they're going to lose the 30 millions anyways, because they're not going to be able to meet the threshold. We know that in previous elections, there are candidates that have ended up with 1%, 2%, 0.5%. They're going to lose the deposit that was paid at when they registered their candidacies because of not meeting the threshold. So for some of them, that money calculus is a false pretense. It's a weak, a lame excuse for not working collectively to bring about the change that Cameroonians need.
If that is
I think
lame, then what could be the reason there?
Yeah, I think that the reason has more to do with political will and a political vision for the country, which then would push everyone to be selfless and less egocentric in the way in which they approach the political process. For example, there are candidates who are running just because they want to be in Biya's shoes and they want to run the country the same way that Biya did. But for me, and probably I'll come to this when we get to your last question, there are certain criteria that I would wish all the opposition candidates thought through and then make the determination as to whether they think they are better off being part of a process that can really help Cameroon usher in a new era of meaningful change and good governance, or whether they want to be perceived once the presidential election is over as the spoilers because of whom Cameroon couldn't make change. And that's a factor which I think each one of the 11 candidates and their supporters have to think through on a daily basis.
Have you spoken to any of the 11 candidates on an individual basis and shared these ideas with them? Because I'm looking at your conversation with Randy Josa, and you mentioned the basic governance agreement as a foundational document that could help usher in this transition. So when you talk to the candidates, how do they buy this?
Well, in the bilateral conversations that people have, as you can imagine, people tend to be very civil and tend to paint the best image of themselves and their platforms and their parties and their supporters. And I think, as I mentioned in that interview with Daily Voice and Randy Josa, sometimes it takes outsiders, people who are not in the realm itself, to be able to say, I come to this with no dog in the fight. I'm looking at the national interest and the future and what the future brings. And these are some objective criteria that I would wish each one of you thought through and help figure out how we can best do this collectively in a way that will be meaningful. There's still a few weeks left. I think there's still opportunities to reinforce some of these points in conversations that I may have with the leaders that are open, and all hope is not lost that this could still happen. And keep in mind that we're talking about 11 candidates, but I can assure you, based on my experience working on these political issues across the continent and even outside of Africa, that if 2 or 3 major candidates take a stance, that it's going to be a snowball effect. And we could see things happen very quickly in the direction that would contribute to meaningful and inclusive change in Cameroon.
I would encourage viewers to read your exclusive interview in the Daily Voice that you had with Randy Josa, because it is very educative. It cuts across the current moment and thinks about the future if we are really thinking about a strong country of our own. It's about 8 pages, so you know how deep the interview is and the content. I'll leave the link in the comments section for those who want to go through this interview to learn more about Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh's work and his experience and his knowledge on democracy and democratic transitions. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us now, you are watching the Beyond Africa podcast with me, your host, Ngalim Bernard, and my guest, Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, and he's taking us through his thoughts on the elections in Cameroon. Let us hear from him what he thinks, and he definitely has ideas. He's been having ideas since even before 1992, and he's been working on them, but Cameroon is not changing. He doesn't seem disappointed. He doesn't seem to have given up. He's still on the beat. He's still hitting the notes and going forward. So with all this, do you think that if there is no coalition candidate, the CPDM wins again?
Well, I don't want to be a prophet of doom because I just can't fathom that this country of 30 million inhabitants are going to entrust the next 7 years in the hands of someone who will soon be turning 93 years old. Someone who has been in power for 43 years and today doesn't have a track record that he or his party could be proud of. When you listen to people defend the current president or the ruling party, there is not a single accomplishment that they can point to and say, we promised this to the Cameroon people and we delivered on it. And so I just can't imagine what the future would hold if that hypothesis were to come true. It's strange that you wouldn't hire a 92-year-old teacher for your kids. You wouldn't hire a cook who was 92 years old. You wouldn't hire a driver for yourself who was 92 years old. But even people who are educated within the ruling party, who've seen how other countries are run, people who have an idea of what presidential responsibilities entail, would try to convince the rest of us that this country that is immersed in multiple multi-sectorial crises should be put back in the hands of someone who is soon to be 93 years old and who has been in power for 43 years and has nothing to show for it. And my sense is that if you look at the contestation that's already happening, even on social media, even in reality, with what's happening in the Northwest and in the Southwest, with what's happening in the extreme north of the country with Boko Haram, with what is happening with porous borders in the east, with the discontent with young people in big cities like Douala and Yaoundé, this country is going to require a lot and a permanent presence of a president to be properly governed. And so a victory by the incumbent in October, I think we all have to go back to the drawing board to figure out what that means for the country and ultimately even for Africa as a continent, given the role that Cameroon could play on that continent, which we haven't played, but also given the strategic location that is Cameroon and how what happens there could impact neighbors in West and Central Africa.
Let us bring this down to who is running this campaign. The President Biya that you saw in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago at the US-Africa Summit and his presentation at the conference he had, at the workshop he had, are you convinced that he is the one putting his candidature forward?
Well, people have raised that question a lot. Some people have even gone as far as asking whether he's aware that he's a candidate and he's aware of what the stakes are for the country. I was here in Washington during that summit. Till this day, there are times when I still tell myself it was a bad dream, it was a nightmare. That wasn't the president of my country representing us the way we saw in those images. It's beyond explanation, but my sense is that there will come a time when the history of Cameroon is going to be written, when we'll get to know what has happened to an otherwise vibrant country, dynamic, well-educated, well-talented people. And how come we accepted the country to be run the way it was run for 43 years and the way that some people are threatening to keep it running for yet another 7 years? There's a lot of opacity around the governance of the country, but my sense is that when these actors are no longer in place, because this too is going to come to pass, then the history books will open, the archives will be open, and we'll get to know for real who tried to govern, but also who took advantage of the fact that Paul Biya was no longer in total control of his capacities to do things that were prejudicial to the country and to the interest of 30 million Cameroonians.
When you say Paul Biya was no longer in full control of his capacities, are you saying the Constitutional Council, when they dismissed the petition by Barrister Karim Muna to invalidate President Biya's candidature based on his inability to execute his duties by himself because he apparently has lost capacity and is dependent on other people?
Well, I know as a jurist myself that decisions of the Constitutional Council are not subject to appeal, but it's also one of those things that allows me to tap into the richness of Cameroon legal history, which even there, under the present context, is being contested by some. But saying that in common law, in the Anglo-Saxon system, there is a well-established principle of habeas corpus. Bring the body, show the person that every time there's litigation about the state of mind or the well-being or the existence of a human being through the writ of habeas corpus, courts have resolved the issue by bringing forward the human being over whose existence there is litigation. The most compelling argument that the CBDM or the court could have ordered would have been for President Paul Biya to show up and say, here I am, capable, able, steady, and ready to run the country if I got elected.
He just did that in the presence of the French ambassador and the apostolic nuncio.
The president presided over National Day ceremonies in May, and then he received one ambassador, the nuncio, the Pope's representative in Cameroon, and then for weeks nobody saw him. And then a few days ago, he received the French ambassador. Is that the basis on which he's going to run the country if he had another 7 years?
That is how he has been running the country. This is not strange to any person who knows how he has been running the country. It's not strange to you, Dr. Chris.
It's only gone worse over the years. And that's why elections are important, because elections allow the citizens to renew the mandate of the incumbent if he has performed well, or to resign his contract and send him to the village if he is underperformed. And that's why the insistence of having credible, meaningful elections is relevant. Because if the elections are meaningful and credible and free and fair and transparent, he should be able to hear from the Cameroonian people that he no longer meets the challenges of the moment and that it was about time Cameroon renewed the political leadership of the country.
Yeah, but how would he hear from the people when he has never been hearing from the people? He has always been where he wants to be, how he wants to be, and the country has been on autopilot. As Eric Chinje said in my conversation with him, Cameroon is a captainless ship and has always been a captainless ship. So what is going to change? The people who have been working with him, collaborating with him, are definitely going to work around the system and ensure that they maintain the power and the advantages that they have. Is that in question?
Well, that's why campaign periods are usually important, because it's during that period that candidates should be able to go out and meet constituents and fellow citizens and explain to them why the contract of the current ruler should not be renewed.
In my conversation with Dr. Simon Munzo, he asked me this question. Have you ever seen President Paul Biya appear like he is begging for a vote throughout his mandate? So is that going to change now?
Well, elections are important for a reason. Campaigns are important for a reason. You can't give up hope except you want to resign your fate to what Biya and his courts want. And so my appeal would still be that in the months that are left, 2 months or a month, that is 6 weeks that are left between now and election day, that party leaders and ordinary citizens need to raise their awareness level and prepare themselves to make that determination. I believe that if there's a huge turnout of people who no longer want Biya's mandate to be renewed, that they are going to find ways to make those voices heard on election day, and they're going to find ways to make sure that their victory, if they have it, is not stolen from them. That's important, and we've seen it happen in other countries. There's no reason why that couldn't happen in Cameroon if that's what the overwhelming majority of Cameroonians wanted.
How can citizens prevent their victory being stolen from them after election?
As I said before, we have seen what civil society organizations are doing across Africa. Recently we saw in Botswana, where a ruling party that had been in the majority for over 40 years lost an election and accepted the outcome. In 2015, we saw that in Nigeria, former President Goodluck lost the election and accepted the outcome even before the Election Commission announced the official results. Thanks to the work that is being done by African civil society organizations, today everybody is a photojournalist. You probably will tell everybody how many clips, video clips, and photographs you receive from home on a daily basis. And so everybody in Cameroon could be a photojournalist at their polling site. And if they put those results from their polling sites together, aggregated as Barrister Ndoki, Michel Ndoki, and others are trying to do, set up this National Builders Network. I've seen alternative networks that are also working towards the main goal. If we get to a point where out of the 8 million registered Cameroonians, there are 20,000 or 25,000 who are willing to be photojournalists at their polling sites on election day, the results of these elections will be known even before Electoral convenes to do the official tabulation. And under those circumstances, it's going to be incredibly difficult for election to announce an election result that doesn't match what may have transpired on election day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us now, you're watching the Beyond Africa podcast with me, your host, Ngalim Bernard, and my guest, Dr. Chris Fomunyoh. I implore all of you to comment, like, share, so we know how we are doing, and you encourage others to join this platform and follow these insightful conversations. In your interview again with the Daily Voice and Randy Josan, you made an allusion to 24/7 president. You've spent the last years critiquing President Paul Biya.
You know, you make a very good point about the fact that I've been very consistent with regards to my observations in terms of the shortcomings or the state of bad governance in Cameroon. Today, on the one hand, I'm dismayed by where the country is, but at the same time, I'm heartened that more and more people are seeing today what I saw 10, 15, 20 years ago. This is a crucial moment. And for me, I believe that voices such as mine need to be more forthcoming. And I do plan between now and October to actually publicly indicate who my preferred candidate would be. There are 5 criteria for me that are most important and that would determine for me who is best placed to run the country. The first criteria would be a candidate who prioritizes the resolution of the Anglophone conflict. There is no reason why we should be living in a country where citizens are killing each other. Even as we speak, atrocities are still happening. Priority number 1. Second priority would be constitutional reform. There is no way that Cameroon of tomorrow is going to be able to build itself back if we concentrate powers in the hands of one individual, as has happened in the past 43 years under Biya. We also need to look at the form of the state. That, for me, is all part of that constitutional reform, which must be a priority for the next president or the candidate who will get my support. It's beyond just reforming the electoral process or the electoral code. I mean, genuine constitutional reform that has to look at the form of the state, how the state is governed, and how we empower our leaders and how we hold them accountable. There is never going to be a situation where we would have a president at the head of the executive who appoints legislators in the legislative branch, who appoints everybody in the judiciary, and you expect that the country is going to be governed democratically. Third point, I need to see in the platforms, not just a narrative that says things people want to hear, but a genuine plan to address the youth bar, the challenges, the economic challenges that young people face, and the inability of the country under the present circumstances to provide opportunities for young people. The fourth issue is economic reform. We have got the resources, but we're lagging behind. And until a candidate is willing to roll up their sleeves and work on the economy like there's no tomorrow, they're not going to get my support. And the fifth point is security sector reform. Nobody is talking about it right now, but for me, we have to reorganize the relationship between citizens and the security apparatus of the country, whether it's the police, the gendarmerie, or the military. And based on these 5 priorities, I'm going to be able to, between now and October, state very categorically which candidate I believe meets this criteria and deserves support that I and other individuals of goodwill should give to help make sure that Cameroon can have an opening and an opportunity to begin to build back as a country.
Thank you so much. Before I come to the various items you've identified and your call that we made between now and October, what do you make of the resignations of Bello Buba and Issa Chiruma from the government?
Well, I think politically it's never too late to make amends. That's the reason why even with the church, there's room for confessions for people before they go to Holy Communion, for those who are Christians. And so I think it's an act of courage on their part, because they could have stayed in government if they wanted to, but they opted to stand out and distance themselves from the Biya regime. There are things now that are being talked about because of public positions that Bello Buba Maigari and Issa Bakari Chiruma have taken. And so that also is an opening which the opposition should seize and should take on, because if that coalition that has been in power for over 40 years, every time if that coalition becomes fragmented, those cracks open up an opportunity that can contribute to more meaningful change for the country. And so I take that in good spirit, and I hope that in the weeks ahead, those two personalities will be able to go out there and explain themselves better and also speak to the point of the contributions that it could make for a new beginning for Cameroon.
You're talking about never being too late to make amends. Does that mean that Issa Chiruma and Bello Buba have faltered to a degree that they must make amends and make confessions before they could be accepted by the Cameroonian population?
Well, I think some of their interviews speak for themselves. The fact that Bello Buba Maigari has said one of his priorities would be resolving the Anglophone conflict. He had never made that kind of pronouncement in the 8 years that this conflict has existed. The fact that Issa Chiruma Bakari said on Equinox TV that he wasn't aware of all of the details when he, as government spokesperson, said there was no Anglophone problem in Cameroon. I mean, these are things that are coming out that show that somewhere around these personalities, there is an opportunity for good and there's an opportunity to rebuild. And we have to be creative about how to leverage all of that into an aggregation of forces that can contribute to meaningful change. Let me tell you, if tomorrow there's 2 or 3 other ministers who want to resign, I would say let them go forward and do that, so that history would at least remember that at a point in time, they felt the need to distance themselves from what is transpired, what has happened in the country, and to position themselves to be able to make a meaningful contribution for good, for the future of the population.
When Professor Kanto had his mega rally in Paris, he called on some members of government, CPD militants who think that it's the right time to change the country to resign and get out or join them, and they will work together to change the country. Do you think this could be one of the motivating factors that encouraged Mr. Bello Buba and Mr. Chiruma to resign from the government?
Well, I think Bello Buba Maigari and Issa Chiruma are seasoned politicians. They probably were in government before Maurice Kamto, and may already have been thinking through these issues on their own. I don't think it's a decision that they made in the last few months or in the first few months of 2025. They've probably been thinking about it, but I think it's an appeal that we should continue to make, to say that there's some good people in government, and if they think that their contribution could still be meaningful and positive for the future of the country, this is probably the time for them to distance themselves from what's currently happening in the Yaoundé and make a stance that can contribute to meaningful change. And we've seen that even in other countries that have made change. There were people who were in the apartheid regime of South Africa who also, at the right moment, distanced themselves from de Klerk and contributed to South Africa having the change that they had today. There were people who were in Macky Sall's government, but when Macky Sall was, toying with the idea of delaying the presidential elections, they stood out, they took a stance, and that meant well for Senegal. So there's no reason why good-minded government officials shouldn't still have the opportunity, should they think fit, to come forward and make amends with the people of Cameroon for the betterment of the country going forward.
Some analysts have argued that Bello Buba and Issa Chiruma pull most of the population in the north and the CPDM is the minority. And there is no question about Maurice Kamto's popularity down south, even across Cameroon. Do you see any possibility of these three working together to get a single candidate amongst the three? And Kamto is out. Do you see the three of them pulling their forces together to challenge the government in place?
I wouldn't be surprised if there are conversations along those lines. But as I said earlier, that, for example, would be a nucleus that could create a domino effect that would even make that possibility more attractive. But my sense is that if they mean well for Cameroon, if they are true patriots, if they have said all along that they're in this not just for themselves, not just because they want to sit in Biya's shoes and do the exact same things that Biya has done, but because they want to sacrifice for the people of the country, then this is the moment when they have to put aside their personal egos, their personal agendas, and find ways to work collectively for the betterment of the greater good.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chris. So I want to come back to the 5 criteria you identified for the topmost person that you could support. Resolving the Anglophone crisis, constitutional reform, including the form of state and the electoral code, addressing the youth economic challenges, addressing the economy in a way that it becomes dependent on itself, and the security sector reform. At this point, all the 12 candidates, I know you've already dismissed Paul Biya, so all the 11 candidates have their manifestos out there. They have their plans out there. Why are you struggling to identify the person to support, and you're saying you're going to do that between now and October? Now is the moment, Dr. Chris. Whom do you endorse and whom do you support for the presidency of Cameroon?
I think one advantage of having a little gray hair or no hair at all, as is my case,
I don't either,
is that you develop the capability to read through manifestos, and that on paper the manifestos look good. Everybody knows what to put into a manifesto to make it attractive. But my hope is that in the weeks ahead, as I get more intense conversations on a one-on-one basis with the candidates that are in the race, that would allow me to garner enough information to be able to make an informed decision and to make it public when I do declare.
Dr. Chris, I don't think this is a question for the future because you know them, you've spoken to most of them, you've read their manifestos already, and at this point, you should have at least an 80% conviction of the person you think Cameroonians should vote for. So who is that person?
I would tell you that, as you know so well, in politics, a day is a lifetime experience. And as soon as I'm ready to make that call, you'll be amongst the first to know.
In politics, a day is a lifetime experience. The same as you could make that call on the 1st of October in preparation for the 12th of October, and then something changes before the 12th of October. So that doesn't change that the 4th of September is as important as the 1st of October or as the 15th of September. Dr. Chris, who is that person?
You know, in the earlier part of our conversations, we talked about conversations that may be ongoing amongst the different candidates. And the fact that people such as myself that are not directly involved are sometimes better placed to be able to help them think through objective criteria that can lend more legitimacy to their candidacies. It's helpful while you're thinking through that and while you're trying to be helpful to not step forward and already make a judgment call that may undermine the very process that you're trying to help build. So with your permission, I would like to defer that announcement for a couple of days, maybe a few short weeks, but to make sure that at the appropriate time, without waiting till the last minute, I also make my position known, laying out the rationale and also how the candidates match the criteria that I consider priorities, and not just for me, but for Cameroon going forward.
The Beyond Africa podcast is waiting for you to come and make that declaration on this platform. But before I let you go, priority number one, the Anglophone crisis. Who are the candidates you think are already thinking positively? Or who are the candidates you think are working positively to resolve the Anglophone crisis? You could name one or two.
Well, many of the candidates have put that into their platforms. And so there's a sense that because we're also in the election season, everyone is now sensitized to the fact that the crisis is still there for real. And so I don't want to shoot out anybody who has positive thoughts about how to resolve this crisis. And I would rather not one by one through each criteria, but rather take a holistic approach that says who meets these 5 criteria and how do they meet it. Because if you go just by the platforms, everybody is for resolving the Anglophone crisis. You need to dig deeper to find out how thoughtful they are, what mechanism they think they have in place, how have they worked with others in the past to derive approaches that could bring this senseless conflict to an end and allow the country to begin to build back up again.
So that is the biggest problem I have, as I said at the beginning of this podcast. I know you're taking it a step further to think about it and come out with that candidate you want Cameroonians to support. But Cameroonians also need time to think and reflect over the person you would propose. And you've had enough time since the Electoral call was convened to do all of this. And we are basically a month into the elections. And you need to tell Cameroonians so that we transmit that message to Cameroonians. And for the last time, Dr. Chris, who is that person?
You are extremely right. In politics, timing is everything. And if we, as we did through our conversation, laid out the hope that as the 11 candidates talk through themselves, you may begin to see some gelling around 1 or 2 candidates that can carry, and probably a domino effect that can lead that process of cohesion, of aggregation of effort. I have to be sensitive to not jumping the gun, so to speak, and inadvertently putting them in an awkward position so that they don't feel like they have to feel empowered to have taken that initiative themselves. And I wouldn't want to inadvertently jeopardize the opportunity of something coming together that is viewed as homegrown from within in a way that can really boost their efforts in the remaining weeks of the campaign. I would be very sensitive to the timing issue. And as I said to you, you'll be amongst the first to know once the decision is made.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chris Fomunyoh, for coming to the Beyond Africa podcast. Do you have any last words for our viewers?
I would just say again how much I really appreciate your efforts. These are challenging times, not just for Cameroon, not just for Africa, but globally. And it's important that African voices like yours, like mine, and like others be out there speaking to issues that relate to the continent, because this is the only way that we're going to be able to give relevance to our own continent in this very competitive global stage that the world has become today. So I really applaud your efforts, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity. I wish you well and lots of success in future endeavors.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us. It's qualitative time, and this is the quality we want to share with our viewers. And we encourage our viewers to watch, comment, like, and share so that others can learn from these conversations. As Dr. Christopher has said, he's definitely going to be back here. He is a patron on this platform. He encourages me behind the scenes. He shares information with me, and he mentors me. So if you want this kind of information, always follow this platform and you would be there at the right time. Dr. Chris has been here. He's been around for a very long time. He's a household name. His story, as you heard, goes back to the 90s, across Cameroon, across Africa, across the United States. He discusses the future of the continent. And of course, if you want to be part of that future of this continent, you need to follow this platform to learn more from him and people like him. Dr. Chris, you are very much appreciated for having spent this time with us. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. It's been a real pleasure, and I wish you lots of success.
Thank you.
Thank you too.